Introduction. The forbidden powers of the human mind. Abilities humanity was conditioned to forget. There are places within the human mind that remain largely unexplored. Not because they do not exist, but because attention was slowly trained away from them. There are experiences that arrive quietly, without permission, and without explanation. A thought that appears before language forms it. A certainty that rises without evidence. A dream that echoes into waking life with unsettling precision. A feeling that someone is near, before anyone enters the room. For most, these moments are dismissed. Filed away. Explained away. Or forgotten entirely. But they do not disappear. They accumulate beneath awareness like sediment beneath still water. Layer upon layer of unexamined perception. This work does not demand belief. It does not require acceptance. It asks only for attention. Careful attention. The kind of attention that does not rush to conclude. The kind that observes before it defines. Across human history, there have been countless accounts describing abilities that seem to extend beyond ordinary sensory experience. Telepathy. The direct impression of thought without spoken language. Intuition. The sudden knowing that arrives without linear reasoning. Remote viewing. The perception of distant places without physical presence. Energetic sensing. The felt awareness of emotional or environmental states beyond obvious cues. Manifestation. The observed alignment between focused intention and lived experience. Clairvoyance. The perception of events, symbols, or impressions not currently present in physical space. Premonitions. The sense of future events before they unfold. Subconscious communication. The exchange of meaning beneath spoken words, beneath conscious awareness. And then there are the children. Those who describe perception before language fully shapes their interpretation of the world. Those who report knowing things they were not taught. Seeing things they were told could not be seen. Feeling things they were told could not be felt. Over time, many of these expressions are softened, reinterpreted, redirected, or silenced through subtle reinforcement. Not always through force, but through repetition of what is considered acceptable reality. What can be measured? What can be proven? What can be repeated under controlled conditions? And so, slowly, a boundary is drawn. Not necessarily between truth and falsehood, but between what is acknowledged and what is ignored. This boundary becomes familiar. So familiar that it begins to feel natural. Even absolute. And yet, throughout cultures and across centuries, similar patterns continue to appear. Independent accounts. Unrelated observers. Separated by language, geography, and time. Yet describing phenomena that resist simple categorization. This creates a question that has never fully disappeared. Not in science. Not in philosophy. Not in the private thoughts of individuals who have experienced something they cannot easily explain. The question is this. Are these experiences evidence of hidden capacities within human cognition? Or are they the mind interpreting coincidence through symbolic pattern? Or something else entirely that has not yet been properly defined? This audiobook does not attempt to resolve that question prematurely. Instead, it invites you into a sustained inquiry. An internal observation. A gradual unfolding of attention toward the subtle layers of experience that are often overlooked. Because whether these phenomena are literal abilities, psychological processes, or interpretive structures of consciousness, the fact remains that people experience them. And the human mind responds to what it experiences. There is also the question of suppression. Not necessarily suppression in the dramatic sense, but in the cultural sense. The gradual narrowing of what is considered appropriate to discuss. The quiet discouragement of certain forms of testimony. The reduction of personal experience to coincidence, bias, or imagination without further inquiry. Over time, this shapes perception itself. What is spoken becomes what is normal. What is not spoken becomes what is invisible. And what is invisible becomes what is assumed not to exist. This is how entire domains of subjective experience can fade from collective conversation. Not by removal, but by neglect. So this work is an invitation. Not to abandon reason, but to expand observation. To include the inner landscape as something worthy of careful study. To notice what arises before it is edited by interpretation. To listen to the mind not only as a generator of thought, but as a field of perception that may not yet be fully mapped. You are not being asked to believe. You are being asked to notice. To remain present with the possibility that human awareness may be more layered than commonly assumed. And that some of those layers may only reveal themselves under sustained attention. What follows is an exploration. A structured descent into themes that have long existed at the edge of accepted understanding. Approached not as certainty, but as inquiry. And so we begin. Carefully. Quietly. With attention. Welcome. You are now entering the forbidden powers of the human mind. Abilities humanity was conditioned to forget. Chapter 1. The suppression of inner knowing. There is a form of knowing that does not arrive through instruction. It does not announce itself with certainty or argument. It does not depend on evidence. It simply appears. Quietly. Directly. Without permission. Most human beings have encountered it, though many do not name it as such. A hesitation before making a decision. A sudden pull away from a path that otherwise seems reasonable. A quiet internal signal that something is not aligned, even when everything appears acceptable on the surface. This kind of knowing is subtle. It does not compete with thought. It exists beneath it. And because it does not shout, it is often ignored. Over time, many people learn to distrust it. Not through a single moment, but through accumulation. A pattern of being corrected. A pattern of being told that instinct is unreliable. That certainty must come from external validation. From authority. From data. From agreement. And so, slowly, attention shifts outward. Away from inner perception. Toward external confirmation. This shift does not happen abruptly. It happens through repetition. Through education systems that prioritize measurable correctness over subjective awareness. Through social environments that reward conformity to shared interpretations of reality. Through language itself, which often struggles to describe what is felt but not yet defined. And in this way, inner knowing becomes difficult to justify. And what cannot be justified is often dismissed. But dismissal does not equal absence. It only indicates that something does not fit within the current framework of explanation. There are reports, across cultures and across time, of individuals who act on what they describe as an internal signal. They change direction without knowing why. They avoid situations that later prove harmful. They recognize patterns before they become visible to others. Sometimes this is attributed to intuition. Sometimes to coincidence. Sometimes to subconscious processing of subtle environmental cues. And sometimes, it is left without explanation at all. This ambiguity is important. Because it reveals the limits of current interpretation, rather than the limits of experience itself. In the absence of full understanding, the mind tends to simplify. To categorize. To reduce complexity into familiar terms. But experience does not always conform to simplification. There are moments that resist explanation without being false. Moments that remain real in memory, even when language fails to contain them. This is where the tension begins. Between lived experience and accepted explanation. Between internal certainty and external validation. Between what is felt and what is permitted to be known. Over time, many individuals resolve this tension by choosing the external over the internal. Not always consciously. Often gradually. They begin to rely more heavily on consensus. On authority. On what is commonly accepted. And in doing so, the inner signal becomes quieter. Not because it disappears, but because it is no longer attended to. Attention is the mechanism through which perception strengthens. What is noticed becomes clearer. What is ignored becomes faint. And what becomes faint eventually feels unreal. This process is not unique to intuition. It applies to all forms of perception. But here, it becomes especially significant. Because inner knowing does not always present itself in a way that demands attention. It waits. And in waiting, it is easily overlooked. There is also a psychological explanation that must be acknowledged. The human brain is constantly interpreting patterns. It predicts outcomes based on prior experience. It processes vast amounts of information below conscious awareness. In many cases, what feels like sudden knowing may be the result of rapid, non-conscious analysis. A synthesis of subtle cues that never reached deliberate thought. This explanation is reasonable. And in many cases, sufficient. But it does not fully close the question. Because there remain instances that resist complete reduction. Moments where no clear data was available. No observable cue was present. And yet the internal signal still arose with clarity. These instances are not easily categorized. They exist at the boundary of understanding. And it is at this boundary that inquiry becomes most important. Not to force a conclusion, but to remain open to multiple possibilities at once. What if inner knowing is not a single mechanism, but a layered process that includes both subconscious computation and forms of awareness not yet fully mapped? What if intuition is not separate from cognition, but an extension of it, operating beneath the threshold of conscious recognition? What if the distinction between psychological processing and something more subtle is not yet clearly defined? These are not claims. They are questions. And questions, unlike conclusions, remain open. This chapter is not attempting to define inner knowing. It is attempting to observe how easily it is dismissed. And how rarely it is examined without bias toward either belief or skepticism. Because both belief and skepticism can close inquiry prematurely. One by accepting too quickly. The other by rejecting too quickly. But observation requires neither. Only attention. Careful attention. The kind that allows experience to be seen without immediate interpretation. So, for the remainder of this exploration, consider the possibility that inner knowing is not something to be proven or disproven at the outset, but something to be noticed, tracked, examined in its own right. Not as a mystery to be solved immediately, but as a pattern of human experience that continues to appear, regardless of explanation. And as we proceed, we will begin to explore what happens when this inner signal is not ignored, but followed. Even when it does not make sense. Especially when it does not make sense. Because that is where the next layer begins. And that is where Chapter 2 will take us. Quietly. Further inward. Chapter 2. The Awakening of Intuition. Long before human beings learned to trust machines, systems, and external authorities, they relied upon something far older. Something immediate. Something deeply internal. An instinctive form of perception that often arrived before conscious thought had time to assemble itself into language. Intuition. Not emotion alone. Not random impulse. But a strange and immediate knowing that appears without visible calculation. a feeling. Anxiety can imitate intuition. In many situations, intuition may indeed reflect unconscious intelligence working faster than deliberate reasoning. But again, there are moments that remain difficult to reduce entirely to subconscious calculation. Instances where no visible clues existed. No prior experience applied. No obvious pattern was available. And yet the intuitive impression still emerged with startling clarity. A sudden certainty about a future event. An immediate distrust of someone later revealed dangerous. A dreamlike knowing that arrives without visible cause. Such moments exist at the edge of explanation. Not fully mystical. Not fully understood. And perhaps this is where intuition becomes most interesting. Because intuition appears to occupy the borderland between ordinary cognition and something deeper within consciousness itself. Ancient cultures often regarded intuition as sacred. Not infallible. But worthy of disciplined attention. Indigenous traditions, philosophers, mystics, healers, and contemplatives throughout history frequently described forms of inner guidance cultivated through silence, observation, and deep awareness. The modern world, however, tends to prioritize external data over internal perception. Observable evidence becomes the primary authority. And while this approach has produced extraordinary scientific advancement, it has also narrowed trust in subjective experience. Many people no longer listen inwardly at all. They override instinct repeatedly in favor of social expectation. They ignore emotional warning signs. Suppress subtle perceptions. Silence internal discomfort. Until eventually, the intuitive signal becomes faint beneath constant noise. Modern life is saturated with interruption. Screens. Notifications. Information streams without end. The mind rarely becomes still enough to hear subtle perception clearly. And intuition rarely shouts. It whispers. This is why silence has always been central to disciplines involving heightened awareness. Meditation. Prayer. Isolation retreats. Contemplation. Deep observation. These practices appear repeatedly across civilizations because silence changes perception. When distraction decreases, subtle awareness becomes easier to notice. Patterns emerge that constant stimulation conceals. This does not mean every quiet thought carries mystical significance. Far from it. Silence also reveals fear. Fantasy. Obsessive thinking. Emotional turbulence. The mind contains many voices. And learning to distinguish intuition from internal noise requires patience. Careful observation. Humility. Ancient teachers often warned students not to confuse emotional intensity with truth. True intuition was described as calm. Clear. Direct. Without desperation. Without emotional chaos. It arrives quietly, yet persistently. Not demanding belief. Only attention. There is another fascinating aspect of intuition. The body often responds before the conscious mind understands why. Tension appears suddenly. The stomach tightens. The heartbeat changes. The nervous system reacts before logical explanation forms. Some researchers believe this occurs because the body processes environmental information more rapidly than conscious thought. The body notices danger first. Then signals awareness afterward. In this sense, intuition may involve the entire nervous system rather than abstract thought alone. The body itself becomes an instrument of perception. And perhaps humanity once understood this more clearly. Ancient traditions frequently emphasized alignment between mind and body. Breath. Movement. Awareness. Stillness. Attention. Modern culture often treats the body as separate from consciousness. A machine carrying the mind. But many philosophical traditions viewed the body as deeply intertwined with awareness itself. A living receiver constantly interacting with subtle layers of experience. Again, caution remains important. Human beings are highly suggestible. People sometimes interpret ordinary emotional reactions as cosmic guidance. Coincidences become exaggerated. Biases become spiritualized. This is why grounded discernment matters. Without grounding, intuition easily becomes fantasy. But rejecting intuition completely creates another imbalance. A life disconnected from inner awareness. A life guided entirely by external systems without internal reflection. Perhaps wisdom lies between extremes. Open-mindedness balanced with skepticism. Observation balanced with restraint. Listening inwardly without surrendering critical thought. This balance is difficult. Because certainty feels safer. People often prefer absolute belief or absolute dismissal. But intuition does not function comfortably within absolutes. It exists in uncertainty. In subtlety. In possibility. And maybe this is why so many people ignore it. Because intuition cannot always be proven in advance. It often asks for trust before evidence appears. And modern civilization rarely rewards such trust. Yet despite all skepticism, intuition continues appearing throughout human experience relentlessly. Quietly guiding. Warning. Pulling. Whispering beneath ordinary thought. Some listen. Most do not. But those who begin paying attention often describe the same realization. The mind may contain layers of perception far deeper than everyday awareness suggests. And intuition may be the first doorway into that hidden terrain. Not the final doorway. Only the beginning. Because beyond intuition lies an even stranger question. Can consciousness perceive beyond the limits of the physical senses themselves? Can the mind reach across distance? Across space? Across unseen connections? This question has fascinated governments, scientists, mystics, and seekers alike for generations. And it is there that our journey now continues. Into the mysterious territory of remote viewing. And perception beyond sight. Chapter 3. The hidden language beneath thought. There are conversations taking place around you constantly. Most are never spoken aloud. They occur beneath expression. Beneath vocabulary. Beneath the carefully constructed surface of personality. Human beings communicate far more than words. A glance can alter emotion. A presence can change the atmosphere of an entire room. A silence can carry more meaning than 1,000 carefully chosen sentences. And yet, most people move through life attending only to the visible layer of communication. The spoken layer. The obvious layer. The layer easiest to measure. But beneath speech exists another current. Subtle. Persistent. Ancient. A field of emotional signaling and unconscious exchange that humanity has participated in long before language fully developed. Even now, the nervous system continuously interprets information outside conscious awareness. Micro-expressions. Changes in breathing. Shifts in posture. Fluctuations in tone. Patterns of tension. Minute movements in the eyes. The body is always listening. Always interpreting. Always responding. Much of what humans call instinct may emerge from this hidden network of perception. An ancient intelligence beneath deliberate thought. An intelligence that notices before the conscious mind understands what has been noticed. And because this process often happens invisibly, people experience the result without seeing the mechanism. A feeling. A sudden discomfort. An unexplained attraction. A sense of danger. A deep trust. The conclusion arrives first. The explanation comes later. Sometimes never. But there are moments that seem to extend beyond ordinary subconscious interpretation. Moments difficult to reduce entirely to visible cues. Instances where individuals report sensing emotional states from great distances. Thinking of someone moments before receiving unexpected contact from them. Feeling overwhelming grief before learning that a tragedy has occurred elsewhere. Dreaming conversations that later unfold with uncanny similarity in waking life. These accounts exist in every culture, every century, every generation. And while many can be explained through coincidence, selective memory, or unconscious pattern recognition, not all experiences fit neatly into those categories. Again, the purpose here is not to force belief. The purpose is to observe the persistence of the phenomenon itself. Why do these experiences continue appearing across unrelated populations? Why do so many individuals privately report moments of connection they cannot fully explain? And why are such experiences so often hidden from public conversation? Perhaps because modern society places immense value on certainty, on measurable outcomes, on controlled repetition. And experiences that emerge through subjectivity become difficult to defend within systems designed around objective verification. So people learn silence. They stop speaking about the strange moments, the unexplainable intuitions, the dreams that later unfolded with impossible accuracy, the sudden emotional impressions that arrived without visible cause. Not necessarily because they did not happen, but because they fear ridicule, dismissal, isolation. And this silence creates an illusion. The illusion that such experiences are rare, when in truth, they may simply be rarely admitted. There is another possibility as well. One more unsettling. What if human consciousness is not entirely isolated? What if thought itself is less private than assumed? Not readable in the simplistic sense imagined by fiction, but interconnected through subtle forms of resonance not yet fully understood. Throughout history, many traditions propose that consciousness behaves less like separate containers and more like fields influencing one another continuously. A shared ocean appearing as individual waves, separate in appearance, connected beneath the surface. Modern neuroscience has not confirmed such claims conclusively. Yet neither has human understanding fully explained consciousness itself. Science can observe neural activity. It can measure electrical patterns, chemical exchanges, regions associated with memory, emotion, and perception. But the fundamental nature of subjective awareness remains unresolved. The deepest question still lingers. Why does consciousness exist at all? And until that question is answered completely, the boundaries of consciousness remain open territory. This is where caution becomes important. Because the human mind is vulnerable to projection, to fantasy, to confirmation bias. People often perceive meaning where none exists, connections where only randomness operates. And any honest exploration must acknowledge this clearly. Not every coincidence is mystical. Not every intuition is profound. Not every emotional impression carries hidden truth. Discernment is necessary. Always. Without discernment, inquiry becomes delusion. But without inquiry, possibility disappears entirely. The balance between openness and grounding is essential. Ancient schools of philosophy understood this well. Students were not taught to accept extraordinary claims blindly. They were taught observation, discipline, patience, stillness. The training was not designed to create believers. It was designed to refine perception, to sharpen awareness carefully enough to distinguish imagination from genuine insight. And perhaps this is what modern humanity has largely forgotten. Not supernatural powers, but disciplined attention. The ability to observe the inner world without immediately distorting it through fear, desire, or expectation. Because the mind is not only a receiver of information, it is also an interpreter. An interpretation can both reveal and deceive. This is why silence has always played such a central role in ancient contemplative traditions. Silence removes distraction. And in the absence of constant noise, subtle patterns become easier to detect. The hidden language beneath thought becomes more noticeable. Not louder. Only clearer. Many people fear silence for this reason. Because silence reveals what distraction conceals. Restlessness. Suppressed emotion. Unresolved memory. Intuition. The deeper currents beneath ordinary thought. And once those currents are noticed, they cannot easily be forgotten again. This may explain why modern life is saturated with stimulation. Constant movement. Constant information. Constant distraction. A mind overwhelmed by noise rarely examines itself deeply. And a mind that never examines itself remains easier to condition. Easier to direct. Easier to define from the outside. But the moment a person becomes deeply observant of their own consciousness, something begins to change. The automatic patterns become visible. The inherited assumptions become visible. The emotional programming becomes visible. And beneath all of it, another layer slowly emerges. Quiet. Patient. Watching. A deeper awareness that was present long before the noise began. Some traditions called this awareness the higher mind. Others called it spirit. Others simply called it attention itself. The name matters less than the experience. Because throughout history, those who entered deeply into self-observation often described arriving at the same realization. That human consciousness may be far more vast than ordinary conditioning allows people to perceive. And if that is true, then the greatest mystery may not be whether hidden abilities exist, but why humanity became so disconnected from its own inner landscape in the first place. That question will guide us further. Into memory. Into symbolism. Into the architecture of belief itself. And into the possibility that the mind has been shaped far more carefully than most people realize. But for now, remain still. Listen carefully. And notice what arises in silence. Because the next chapter begins there. Chapter 4. The architecture of belief. There are structures within the human mind that most people never consciously examine. Invisible frameworks. Silent assumptions. Mental architecture built slowly over years of repetition. By the time a person reaches adulthood, countless ideas have already settled deep beneath conscious awareness. Ideas about reality. About limitation. About identity. About what is possible. And perhaps most importantly, about what is impossible. Most people assume their beliefs were chosen rationally. But many beliefs were absorbed long before critical thought fully developed. Through family. Through culture. Through authority. Through repetition. The human mind learns first through acceptance. Only later through questioning. And because of this, early impressions often root themselves deeply within perception itself. A child enters the world in a state of openness. Observing constantly. Absorbing constantly. The boundary between imagination and reality remains fluid. Possibility feels natural. Wonder feels natural. The unseen feels close. But gradually, the world begins teaching the child what is considered real. What is acceptable? What is reasonable? What deserves attention? And what deserves dismissal? This conditioning is not always malicious. In many cases, it emerges from the practical needs of society itself. Order requires agreement. Civilization depends upon shared assumptions. A functioning culture must establish consensus reality to maintain stability. And so, certain forms of perception are encouraged, while others are quietly abandoned. Over time, imagination becomes associated with immaturity. Inner knowing becomes associated with irrationality. Deep intuition becomes reduced to coincidence. And experiences that cannot be externally verified become increasingly difficult to discuss openly. Eventually, many people stop questioning the structure entirely. Not because they investigated every possibility, but because the architecture of belief became invisible through familiarity. This is one of the most powerful characteristics of conditioning. When repeated long enough, it ceases to feel imposed. It begins to feel self-evident, natural, absolute. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates that consensus reality changes. Entire civilizations once believed things later proven incomplete or incorrect. Human understanding evolves continuously. What one era dismisses, another may later investigate seriously. And what one generation calls impossible, another may eventually normalize. This does not mean every forbidden idea is true. Far from it. Human beings are capable of extraordinary self-deception. But it does mean that certainty should remain flexible, especially regarding subjects not yet fully understood. The architecture of belief shapes perception itself. People often see what they expect to see. Notice what they are trained to notice. Ignore what they are trained to ignore. This process occurs automatically, continuously. The brain filters enormous amounts of information every second. Without these filters, ordinary functioning would become impossible. But filters also create blindness. Not intentional blindness. Structural blindness. A person cannot easily perceive what their framework excludes from consideration. And so, two individuals may witness the same event and interpret it entirely differently. One sees coincidence. Another sees meaning. One sees imagination. Another sees intuition. One sees random emotional reaction. Another senses invisible connection. The event remains the same. The interpretation changes according to the architecture surrounding perception. This is why belief is never merely intellectual. Belief shapes experience itself. It influences attention, emotion, memory, expectation, even physical response. Modern psychology has demonstrated repeatedly that perception is deeply influenced by prior assumptions. Placebo effects alter physiology. Expectation alters performance. Fear alters interpretation. Attention alters memory formation. The mind is not a passive observer. It actively participates in constructing lived reality. This realization carries enormous implications. Because if perception is partially constructed internally, then the boundaries of experience may be more flexible than previously assumed. Again, caution is necessary here. Flexibility does not mean unlimited fantasy. Reality still imposes constraints. Objective conditions still exist. But human interpretation of reality may remain far more malleable than many realize. And throughout history, institutions have always understood the power of shaping belief. Governments shape belief. Religions shape belief. Educational systems shape belief. Media shapes belief. Families shape belief. Even language itself shapes belief. Words define categories. Categories define thought. Thought defines perception. And perception influences behavior. A society does not need to control every action directly if it successfully conditions the boundaries of what people consider possible. Because most individuals will remain inside those boundaries voluntarily. This is not necessarily conspiracy. Often it is inheritance. Systems perpetuating themselves automatically across generations. People teaching what they themselves were taught. Without malicious intent. without conscious awareness. And yet the effect remains powerful. Entire populations can inherit limitations without recognizing them as inherited. This becomes especially important when discussing consciousness. Because if human beings are taught from an early age that certain experiences are impossible, meaningless, or irrational, many will stop paying attention to those experiences entirely. Not because the experiences vanished, but because attention itself was redirected. The mind learns quickly what receives approval and what receives ridicule. And ridicule is one of the strongest tools of social conditioning. Many people would rather suppress a genuine experience than risk social isolation by speaking about it openly. So the experiences retreat inward. Into privacy. Into silence. Into memory. And slowly, a culture emerges where countless individuals privately encounter unusual moments while publicly pretending such moments never occur. This creates fragmentation. An outer reality and an inner reality existing simultaneously. One spoken. One hidden. Ancient mystery schools understood something modern society often overlooks. Human beings are deeply suggestible. Not weak. Not foolish. Simply impressionable. Consciousness absorbs patterns continuously. Rituals. Symbols. Stories. Authority figures. Emotionally charged repetition. All of these shape internal perception over time. This can be used constructively or destructively, to expand awareness or to narrow it. And perhaps this is why stories have always carried such power. Stories bypass resistance. They enter beneath analytical defenses. They shape imagination. And imagination influences possibility itself. A civilization's stories become the blueprint of its collective mind. If a culture repeatedly tells human beings they are limited, disconnected, powerless, and insignificant, those ideas eventually begin to feel real. Not because they are objectively final truths, but because repeated narratives condition perception. And conditioned perception shapes behavior. This is why reclaiming awareness begins with questioning inherited assumptions. Not rejecting everything blindly. Not accepting everything blindly. But examining carefully. Observing where beliefs originated. Asking which ideas emerged through direct experience. And which were inherited unconsciously. Because once a person begins examining the architecture of belief, something remarkable happens. The structure loses some of its invisibility. Automatic assumptions become noticeable. Conditioning becomes noticeable. Fear-based limitations become noticeable. And in that moment, awareness begins separating itself from programming. The observer awakens slightly from the script. Not completely, but enough to recognize that the script exists. This recognition can feel unsettling at first. Because certainty provides comfort. Even limiting certainty. But uncertainty opens space. And space allows inquiry. The deeper question is not merely whether humanity possesses forgotten abilities. The deeper question is this. What becomes possible when the limits of inherited belief begin to loosen? What hidden aspects of consciousness become visible when the architecture itself is finally questioned? That inquiry will guide us further inward. Toward symbols. Toward dreams. Toward the strange relationship between thought, emotion, and reality itself. But before continuing, pause for a moment. And consider carefully. Which beliefs within your own mind were truly chosen? And which simply arrived through repetition? Because the answer to that question may alter far more than you expect. Chapter 5. The Secret World of Dreams and Symbols. There are realms of human experience that emerge only when the waking mind grows quiet. Places the rational mind rarely controls completely. Places where logic softens. where identity becomes fluid, where memory, emotion, fear, intuition, and imagination begin speaking in a language older than words. Every night, humanity enters this territory. And every morning, most of it is forgotten. Dreams have fascinated human beings for thousands of years. Ancient civilizations treated them as messages, warnings, prophecies, windows into hidden dimensions of the self. Some cultures believe dreams connected human consciousness to divine intelligence. Others believe dreams revealed unresolved emotional patterns buried beneath waking awareness. Even now, modern science continues studying dreams without fully understanding why consciousness creates them at all. The brain remains active during sleep. Memory reorganizes. Emotions process. Information integrates. Neural pathways strengthen and weaken continuously. These explanations describe mechanisms. But the deeper mystery remains. Why does the sleeping mind communicate through symbols instead of direct explanation? Why do dreams often speak in metaphor, in fragmented imagery, in emotional atmosphere rather than linear language? A house collapsing, a staircase descending endlessly, an ocean swallowing the horizon, a forgotten child standing silently in the corner of a dream. These images often feel deeply meaningful even when their meaning remains unclear. It is as though the unconscious mind speaks through symbolic architecture rather than ordinary conversation. And perhaps it must. Because symbols can contain layers of meaning beyond simple language. A single image can communicate emotion, memory, instinct, and psychological tension simultaneously. This is why symbols have shaped human civilization from the beginning. Ancient temples, sacred geometry, myths, religious imagery, rituals, flags, icons, archetypes. Human beings respond to symbols instinctively, often without conscious awareness. A symbol bypasses intellectual resistance and communicates directly with deeper layers of perception. This power has been understood throughout history. Used by spiritual traditions, political systems, secret societies, religions, empires, modern advertising. All recognize the same truth. The subconscious mind responds profoundly to symbolic repetition. And dreams may represent the subconscious speaking in its native language. Not through rational explanation, but through encoded imagery. There are dreams that seem ordinary. Reflections of daily stress. Fragments of memory reorganizing themselves during sleep. Emotional residue replaying beneath consciousness. But there are other dreams that feel different. Unusually vivid. Unusually coherent. Dreams that remain emotionally charged long after waking. Dreams carrying a strange sense of importance. As though something within the mind is attempting communication with extraordinary urgency. Many people report dreams that later appear connected to future events. Not always literally. Sometimes symbolically. A dream of flooding before emotional collapse. A dream of fire before dramatic transformation. A dream of losing teeth before periods of instability or fear. Psychology often interprets such dreams as symbolic projections of subconscious anxiety. And many times, this explanation is entirely reasonable. But again, there are experiences that resist easy reduction. Individuals dreaming specific details before they occur. Locations never visited. Conversations not yet spoken. Events later unfolding with unsettling similarity. Skeptics point toward coincidence and selective memory. Believers point toward precognition. And perhaps both interpretations reveal only part of a larger picture not yet fully understood. What matters here is not forcing certainty, What matters is recognizing that dreams continue to influence human beings profoundly regardless of explanation. Dreams alter emotion, behavior, decision-making, creativity, fear, hope. Entire works of art, scientific discoveries, and life-changing insights have reportedly emerged through dreams. The sleeping mind appears capable of forms of association and perception unavailable during ordinary waking consciousness. Why? Perhaps because the analytical mind relaxes during sleep. The rigid filters of ordinary perception weaken. The boundaries between memory, imagination, intuition, and unconscious processing become more fluid. And within that fluidity, hidden material rises to the surface. Carl Jung proposed that beneath the personal unconscious exists something deeper. A collective unconscious shared symbolically across humanity. A reservoir of universal archetypes appearing repeatedly throughout myth, religion, and dreams across unrelated cultures. The wise old figure. The shadow. The labyrinth. The great mother. The flood. The rebirth. These patterns emerge globally with astonishing consistency. Why do human beings separated by oceans and centuries produce similar symbolic structures? Some argue it reflects shared evolutionary psychology. Others suspect something deeper within consciousness itself. Again, the question remains open. But the repetition is undeniable. Symbols seem to arise from somewhere deeper than deliberate invention alone. And perhaps this explains why certain dreams feel less like fantasy and more like encounters. As though the dreamer is entering a psychological landscape already waiting beneath conscious awareness. Ancient initiatory traditions often placed enormous importance on dreams for this reason. Dreams were not automatically trusted. But neither were they dismissed. They were studied carefully. Recorded. Interpreted. Observed over time. Patterns mattered more than isolated experiences. Discernment mattered more than excitement. Because the symbolic mind can both illuminate and deceive. A dream may reveal truth. And in doing so, lose contact with balance entirely. But rejecting symbolism completely creates another kind of blindness. A purely literal mind often loses access to the deeper emotional and intuitive dimensions of human experience. But over time, many people begin noticing a strange relationship between attention and reality itself. What the mind repeatedly focuses upon often appears to expand within lived experience. Psychology offers several explanations for this phenomenon. The brain naturally filters information according to relevance. When attention becomes emotionally charged, awareness sharpens around specific patterns. A person thinking constantly about a certain car suddenly notices that car everywhere. Not because the car appeared more frequently, but because perception became tuned toward it. This process is real, observable, measurable. The mind continuously selects which information enters conscious awareness. And much of reality remains invisible simply because attention is directed elsewhere. But focused intention appears to influence more than perception alone. At least according to countless personal accounts throughout history. People describe periods where concentrated belief, emotion, visualization, and sustained intention seem connected to unusual shifts in circumstance. Not always instantly. Not magically. But gradually. As though inner alignment begins influencing outer behavior, decision-making, emotional energy, and perhaps even interpersonal dynamics in subtle ways difficult to fully track. This territory is often called manifestation. A word surrounded by confusion, exaggeration, and misunderstanding. Some portray it as supernatural wish fulfillment. Others dismiss it entirely as fantasy. But beneath both extremes exists a more nuanced question. To what extent does human consciousness influence lived reality? Certainly, thought influences behavior. Behavior influences action. Action influences outcome. Belief influences confidence. Confidence influences communication. Communication influences relationships and opportunity. In this sense alone, internal states undeniably shape external experience. A fearful mind behaves differently than a confident one. A hopeless person perceives possibilities differently than an inspired person. Expectation alters posture, tone, decision-making, persistence, even biological response. Modern science confirms repeatedly that mental states influence physical systems within the body. Stress alters immunity. Hope influences resilience. Expectation affects performance. The placebo effect demonstrates something extraordinary. Belief alone can trigger measurable physiological changes under certain conditions. This should not be ignored lightly, because it reveals that thought is not separate from physical experience. Consciousness interacts continuously with biology. The deeper mystery begins when individuals report effects extending beyond internal psychology alone. Moments where focused intention appears connected to improbable external alignment. Synchronicities. Meaningful coincidences. Unexpected encounters arriving at strangely precise moments. Events unfolding with an almost symbolic quality. Carl Jung used the term synchronicity to describe meaningful coincidence lacking obvious causal connection. Not random coincidence, but coincidence experienced as psychologically significant. A book falling open to the exact phrase needed at a critical moment. Meeting a stranger who delivers information deeply connected to an internal question never spoken aloud. Repeated symbols appearing during periods of emotional transformation. Again, skepticism remains important. The human brain excels at pattern recognition. Sometimes excessively. People naturally seek meaning. And meaning can be projected onto randomness. This is true. But the persistence of synchronicity across human experience remains fascinating nonetheless. Because even when explained psychologically, such moments often carry transformative emotional impact. They alter perception, direction, belief. And perhaps this is where the true power resides. Not necessarily in violating physical laws, but in shaping consciousness itself. A meaningful coincidence can redirect an entire life. A single moment of symbolic alignment can awaken motivation, courage, or self-reflection powerful enough to alter future outcomes dramatically. In this way, meaning itself becomes causative. The interpretation changes the person. And the changed person changes their reality through subsequent action. Yet some traditions suggest something even deeper. The possibility that consciousness participates in reality more actively than modern materialism typically assumes. Ancient philosophies often described the universe not as dead matter accidentally producing awareness, but as a living field of intelligence within which consciousness plays a central role. In such frameworks, thought is not isolated. Emotion is not isolated. Intention carries influence. Not absolute control, but influence. Like waves spreading through interconnected systems. Modern physics is sometimes used carelessly to justify mystical claims. This should be approached carefully. Quantum mechanics does reveal strange properties within reality at microscopic levels. Observation appears connected to probabilistic outcomes in certain experimental contexts. But translating this directly into claims that human thought controls reality is scientifically unsupported. And honesty requires acknowledging that distinction clearly. Still, unresolved questions remain regarding consciousness itself. How subjective awareness relates to physical reality remains one of the greatest mysteries in science and philosophy. No consensus explanation fully accounts for conscious experience. Which means the relationship between mind and reality remains partially open territory. And where uncertainty exists, inquiry remains valuable. Not blind belief. Not blind dismissal. Inquiry. Perhaps focused intention functions less like magic and more like alignment. The organization of thought, emotion, behavior, attention, and expectation toward a unified direction. Most people exist in contradiction internally. They desire one outcome while emotionally expecting another. They speak positively while imagining failure constantly beneath the surface. Their attention becomes fragmented, scattered, pulled in opposing directions. Focused intention may derive power partly from coherence. A mind, emotion, and behavior moving together rather than against one another. This kind of internal alignment changes perception profoundly. It alters energy, presence, persistence, decision-making. The individual becomes less divided internally. And less division often produces greater effectiveness externally. Ancient disciplines understood this deeply. Meditation, prayer, visualization, ritual, breathwork, chanting, contemplation. These practices appear across civilizations separated by enormous distances and time periods. Different cultures, different languages, yet repeatedly arriving at similar conclusions. Attention shapes experience. Focused consciousness alters the individual. And altered individuals interact with reality differently. Whether one interprets this spiritually, psychologically, or neurologically, the practical effect remains significant. A focused mind is powerful. A disciplined mind even more so. But there is danger here as well. Because many people become trapped in magical thinking. They begin believing every outcome results entirely from personal vibration or intention. This creates distortion, guilt, delusion. Reality includes countless forces beyond individual control. Chance exists. Social systems exist. Biology exists. Tragedy exists. No philosophy of intention should erase compassion or complexity. Not every suffering person failed to think positively enough. Such ideas become spiritually harmful when taken to extremes. Balanced understanding matters. Always. Perhaps the deeper truth lies somewhere more subtle. Human consciousness may not control reality completely. But it undeniably participates in reality continuously. Through perception, interpretation, emotion, behavior, attention, relationship, meaning, and possibly through dimensions not yet fully understood. This possibility alone changes everything. Because if consciousness participates in shaping experience, then the quality of attention becomes profoundly important. What people repeatedly consume mentally matters. What they fear matters. What they imagine matters. What they rehearse internally matters. The stories repeated within the mind gradually shape identity itself. And identity influences destiny more quietly than most people realize. This is why ancient traditions guarded attention carefully. They understood something modern civilization often forgets. Where attention flows, energy follows. And whatever receives sustained attention gradually strengthens within the human mind. Fear strengthens through attention. Desire strengthens through attention. Compassion strengthens through attention. Awareness strengthens through attention. Even perception itself sharpens according to what the mind repeatedly observes. Perhaps this is the hidden mechanism beneath many so-called forbidden abilities. Not supernatural power, but disciplined consciousness refined beyond ordinary distraction. A mind trained to observe subtle patterns most people overlook. A mind no longer entirely enslaved by unconscious reaction. A mind capable of directing itself intentionally. And perhaps that is far rarer than any mystical phenomenon. Because most people do not control their attention. Their attention is controlled for them. pulled constantly by noise, stimulation, fear, advertising, conflict, distraction. And a distracted mind is easily shaped. But a focused mind, a deeply observant mind, a disciplined mind, becomes increasingly difficult to condition. Which may explain why throughout history, systems of power often feared individuals who learned to master themselves internally. Because inward mastery eventually alters outward behavior. And outward behavior alters reality itself. The next stage of this journey leads even deeper into the possibility of perception beyond ordinary sensory limits. Remote viewing. Energetic awareness. The strange reports of individuals who claim to perceive information across distance without physical contact. A subject both controversial and endlessly fascinating. But before entering that territory, pause. Observe your own attention carefully. Notice where it goes automatically. Notice what repeatedly occupies your inner world. Because attention is never neutral. It is shaping you continuously. Even now. Chapter 7. Beyond the physical senses. Human beings are taught from an early age that reality is experienced through 5 primary senses. Sight, hearing, touch, taste, smell. These senses become the accepted gates of perception, the official boundaries through which the world is understood. And certainly, they are extraordinary. Through them, civilizations were built. Science emerged. Technology advanced. Entire worlds of experience unfolded. But there remains an unsettling question that has followed humanity across centuries. What if the senses are not the full extent of perception? What if they are only the visible layer of a far larger system of awareness? Throughout history, individuals have reported experiences suggesting perception beyond ordinary sensory contact. Sensing danger before visible evidence appears. Knowing who is calling before answering the phone. Feeling watched while physically alone. Perceiving emotional tension immediately upon entering a room where no words have been spoken. At first glance, many of these experiences can be explained reasonably. Subtle environmental cues. Instinct. Probability. Pattern recognition operating beneath conscious awareness. And often, such explanations are correct. But there are reports that extend further still. Accounts of individuals perceiving distant locations without physical presence. Describing hidden objects. Experiencing vivid impressions later connected to real events occurring elsewhere. Some dismiss all such claims immediately. Others accept them too quickly. Both reactions close inquiry prematurely. Because the truth is more complicated. The subject of perception beyond the senses has attracted not only mystics and spiritual traditions, but scientists, governments, military programs, researchers attempting, however cautiously, to investigate whether human consciousness possesses capacities not yet fully understood. One of the most controversial areas of study became known as remote viewing. The reported ability to perceive information about distant people, places, or events without ordinary sensory access. During the 20th century, various experiments explored whether certain individuals could consistently describe hidden targets under controlled conditions. Results remain heavily debated. Some researchers claimed statistically significant findings. Critics argued flaws in methodology, interpretation, and experimental control. To this day, no universal scientific consensus exists confirming remote viewing as an established ability. And honesty requires acknowledging that clearly. Yet the persistence of interest remains remarkable. Because despite skepticism, unusual results continued appearing often enough to prevent the subject from disappearing entirely. Why? Perhaps because consciousness itself remains deeply mysterious. Science can map neural activity, Track electrical signaling. Measure brain states associated with perception. But the relationship between brain activity and subjective awareness is still not fully solved. The brain may generate consciousness. Or it may filter consciousness. Or consciousness itself may emerge through processes not yet completely understood. The deeper humanity studies awareness, the stranger the questions become. There are individuals who report sensing emotional states across great distances. Twins describing simultaneous experiences. Families feeling sudden dread moments before tragedy. People awakening in the night with overwhelming certainty that something has happened elsewhere, only to later confirm the event. Again, coincidence explains some cases. Selective memory explains others. The human mind naturally seeks patterns and meaning. This must always be remembered. But not every account disappears so easily under simple dismissal. And perhaps what unsettles people most is not the possibility that such experiences occur, but what they would imply if even partially true. Because if consciousness can perceive beyond ordinary sensory limitation, then the modern understanding of separation becomes less stable. The assumption that minds exist entirely isolated from one another begins to weaken. And this possibility carries profound psychological consequences. Modern civilization depends heavily upon material certainty, predictability, measurement, controlled explanation. But human consciousness continues producing experiences that resist perfect containment within existing models. Not enough to establish clear proof, but enough to sustain mystery. Enough to keep the question alive. Ancient traditions often described reality as layered. Visible worlds existing alongside invisible structures of energy, thought, spirit, or consciousness. Different cultures used different language. Life force. Chi. Prana. Spirit. Field. Ether. Though interpretations varied, a recurring idea appeared repeatedly. Human beings may participate in forms of connection extending beyond physical contact alone. Modern language often avoids such concepts because they are difficult to measure objectively. And caution is wise. History contains countless false claims, exaggerated stories, manipulative teachers, and self-deception disguised as enlightenment. Extraordinary claims require careful scrutiny. Always. But caution should not become intellectual paralysis. The refusal to investigate at all. True inquiry requires balance. Open-mindedness without gullibility. Skepticism without arrogance. Because both blind belief and blind dismissal distort perception. There is another possibility worth considering. What people interpret as psychic perception may sometimes arise from forms of subconscious sensitivity far more advanced than commonly realized. The nervous system may detect patterns invisible to conscious awareness. Tiny environmental shifts. Behavioral inconsistencies. Energetic tension expressed physically through posture, breathing, micro-movements, and emotional resonance. Perhaps the mind assembles these signals rapidly into impressions that feel mysterious only because the underlying process remains unconscious. This explanation may account for many experiences. But perhaps not all. And again, the boundary remains uncertain. That uncertainty is important. Because uncertainty invites humility. Humanity has often mistaken incomplete understanding for final understanding. Again and again throughout history. Entire generations declaring impossible what later became ordinary knowledge. This does not mean every extraordinary claim is true. But it does mean reality may exceed current models more often than people assume. There is also the question of training. Many ancient disciplines treated perception as something that could be refined. Not through fantasy, but through disciplined awareness. Meditation. Observation. Stillness. Control of attention. Emotional regulation. Students were taught first to quiet internal noise. Because a chaotic mind distorts perception constantly. Fear distorts. Desire distorts. Expectation distorts. Projection distorts. To perceive clearly, one must first become inwardly still. Perhaps this is why modern life weakens subtle awareness so effectively. The average mind rarely rests. Thoughts race continuously. Attention fractures constantly. The nervous system remains overloaded by stimulation. And within constant distraction, subtle perception becomes almost impossible to notice. A distracted mind struggles to perceive anything deeply. Not only spiritually. Even physically. Most people do not fully observe the world around them. They glance. React. Consume. Move on. But deep perception requires sustained attention. Presence. Silence. Patience. Qualities increasingly rare in the modern world. And perhaps this is why stories of extraordinary perception often emerge from individuals who withdrew from ordinary distraction. Mystics. Monastics. Meditators. Indigenous trackers. Contemplatives. People trained to observe with unusual precision. Whether one interprets their experiences psychologically or spiritually, one fact remains undeniable. Attention changes perception. The more carefully a person observes, the more reality appears layered and complex. What once seemed obvious becomes mysterious again. And mystery, when approached honestly, has the power to transform consciousness. Because mystery interrupts arrogance. It reminds human beings how little they truly understand. And perhaps that humility is the beginning of wisdom itself. The greatest danger is not mystery. The greatest danger is false certainty. The assumption that all meaningful questions have already been answered. That consciousness has already been fully explained. That reality contains nothing beyond current frameworks. History rarely rewards such assumptions for long. As this journey continues, we move deeper still. Into one of the most controversial and emotionally charged territories of all. The possibility that thoughts, emotions, and human energy influence one another in ways largely invisible to ordinary awareness. The unseen atmosphere between people. The silent transmission of emotional states. The hidden force of energetic influence. But before entering that territory, pause for a moment. And consider how much of reality you experience directly. And how much is filtered through assumption. Because the boundary between the known and the unknown may be far thinner than it first appears. Chapter 8. Energetic influence and emotional frequency. There are atmospheres that cannot be seen. And yet they are felt immediately. A person enters a room after an argument has taken place. No words are spoken. No explanation is given. And still, something feels heavy. Dense. Uncomfortable. Another room feels entirely different. Calm. Warm. Safe. The environment itself seems to carry emotional residue long after the visible event has ended. Most people have experienced this. Though few pause long enough to examine it carefully. Human beings affect one another constantly in ways that extend far beyond spoken communication. Emotions spread rapidly through groups. Fear spreads. Laughter spreads. Panic spreads. Confidence spreads. Even silence spreads. One anxious person can alter the emotional tone of an entire gathering without saying a single word. This is not mystical fantasy. Modern psychology and neuroscience both acknowledge forms of emotional contagion. Human nervous systems respond to one another continuously. Facial expressions. Body posture. Breathing rhythms. Tone of voice. Micro-expressions. Hormonal signals. Subtle behavioral cues. The body is constantly interpreting emotional information beneath conscious awareness. People influence each other far more deeply than they realize. And because much of this exchange happens invisibly, it often feels mysterious. A person may leave a conversation suddenly exhausted without understanding why. Another interaction leaves them energized and clear-minded. Some individuals seem to radiate calm naturally. Others radiate tension. Some environments feel draining. Others feel restorative. Ancient traditions often describe this phenomenon using the language of energy. Life force. Vital force. Spiritual atmosphere. Different cultures used different names. Yet many pointed toward the same observation. Human beings affect one another invisibly and continuously. Modern language often avoids such terminology because the word energy is used imprecisely in many spiritual circles. And caution is important. Not every emotional shift involves supernatural forces. Many experiences can be explained through psychology, biology, and social behavior. But explanation does not erase the experience itself. The experience remains real. People genuinely influence one another emotionally and physiologically. The deeper question is how far that influence extends. There are individuals whose presence seems unusually powerful. Not because of physical strength, but because of emotional intensity, awareness, confidence, calmness, or emotional chaos. History is filled with figures whose presence altered entire crowds. Leaders, teachers, mystics, orators, performers. Some inspired hope. Others spread fear. One deeply regulated individual can calm a frightened group. One fearful individual can trigger panic throughout a crowd. Human consciousness appears interconnected through invisible emotional feedback systems constantly operating beneath awareness. And perhaps this explains why certain people instinctively guard their inner state carefully. Because emotional conditions spread. Negativity spreads. Bitterness spreads. Hopelessness spreads. But so do compassion, stillness, courage, peace. This is why environments matter profoundly. The human nervous system adapts continuously to repeated emotional conditions. A person surrounded constantly by fear-based messaging begins absorbing that atmosphere internally. A person surrounded by conflict gradually normalizes tension. A person surrounded by beauty, calm, and reflection often begins changing internally as well. Attention shapes emotion. Emotion shapes physiology. Physiology shapes perception. And perception shapes behavior. The cycle continues endlessly. Modern civilization saturates human attention with stimulation designed to provoke emotional reaction. Fear. Outrage. Comparison. Desire. Anxiety. The nervous system rarely receives rest. And an overstimulated nervous system becomes easier to influence. Less reflective. More reactive. Perhaps this is why silence feels uncomfortable for so many people. Because beneath distraction, unresolved emotional currents begin surfacing. Grief. Fear. Loneliness. Restlessness. The modern world provides endless distraction partly because distraction suppresses self-observation. And a person who never observes their inner condition remains deeply vulnerable to unconscious influence. Ancient contemplative traditions recognized this clearly. Students were often taught first to master emotional regulation before pursuing higher knowledge. Why? Because perception becomes distorted when emotion controls awareness completely. Fear alters interpretation. Anger narrows perception. Desperation clouds discernment. A reactive mind cannot perceive clearly. And perhaps this is the true meaning behind many ancient teachings regarding purification or inner balance. Not moral superiority. Not perfection. But clarity. The calmer the internal state becomes, the easier subtle patterns become to observe accurately. This may also explain why highly emotional environments feel exhausting. The nervous system absorbs tension continuously. Even when people attempt to hide it outwardly. The body listens beneath words. Children especially appear sensitive to emotional atmosphere. Long before they fully understand language, they respond to tone, tension, emotional inconsistency, and hidden conflict. A child often senses when something is wrong before adults openly acknowledge it. The nervous system perceives far more than conscious conversation admits. There are also reports throughout history of individuals sensing emotional or physical states from a distance. Feeling sudden grief before learning of tragedy. Sudden anxiety before receiving disturbing news. Intense emotional impressions linked to loved ones far away. Again, coincidence explains some experiences. Emotional memory exaggerates others. The human mind naturally searches for meaningful connection. This must be acknowledged honestly. Yet such reports continue appearing persistently across cultures and generations. Enough to keep the mystery alive. Enough to suggest that human emotional connection may operate more deeply than current models fully explain. There is another aspect to this subject rarely discussed carefully. Protection of attention. Many ancient disciplines emphasized guarding the mind against destructive influence. Not through paranoia, but through awareness. Because what enters consciousness repeatedly begins shaping consciousness itself. Violence repeatedly consumed affects emotional baseline. Fear repeatedly consumed affects nervous system regulation. Negativity repeatedly consumed alters perception gradually over time. The mind becomes what it repeatedly absorbs. This is not mystical punishment. It is conditioning. And perhaps this is why certain environments feel spiritually suffocating while others feel restorative. The atmosphere surrounding a person influences inner life continuously. Music influences emotion. Architecture influences emotion. Lighting influences emotion. Words influence emotion. Symbols influence emotion. Human beings exist in constant interaction with emotional fields both internal and external. This does not mean every unpleasant interaction involves dark forces or invisible attacks. Such thinking easily becomes paranoia. Balance remains essential. But it does mean emotional awareness matters deeply. The quality of attention matters deeply. And the emotional environments people inhabit shape them more than they often realize. There is also the question of coherence. Some individuals appear deeply fragmented internally. Their thoughts pull one direction. Their emotions another. Their actions another still. Others possess unusual internal alignment. Their presence feels grounded. Clear. Steady. Perhaps this coherence itself creates powerful influence. Because human beings instinctively respond to stability. To calm certainty. To genuine presence. A person who has mastered their inner state becomes difficult to manipulate emotionally. Difficult to provoke. Difficult to control through fear. And perhaps this is why inner mastery has always been regarded as threatening by systems dependent upon emotional reaction. Fearful populations are predictable. Reactive populations are predictable. Distracted populations are predictable. But deeply self-aware individuals become harder to direct unconsciously. Because they begin observing the mechanisms influencing them. And observation weakens unconscious control. This may be one of the most forgotten powers of the human mind. Not domination over others. But mastery over one's own internal atmosphere. The ability to remain centered amidst chaos. To choose attention consciously. To regulate emotion rather than becoming enslaved by it. To perceive clearly without drowning in reaction. Such mastery is not easy. It requires discipline, honesty, self-observation, patience. But perhaps it is far more transformative than extraordinary psychic phenomena. Because a person who masters their own mind changes every interaction they enter, every environment they inhabit, every relationship they touch. And from that inner stability, deeper perception may begin emerging naturally. Not through force, but through clarity. As this journey continues, we move toward one of the most emotionally powerful mysteries of all. The strange awareness often reported by children. The perceptions that appear early in life before social conditioning fully takes hold. The invisible sensitivity many lose as they grow older. And the unsettling question that follows. What exactly did humanity forget? And when did it begin? Chapter 9. The Mystery of Psychic Children. There is a peculiar openness in childhood that many adults no longer remember clearly. A way of perceiving the world before certainty hardens around the mind. Before society fully teaches the difference between what is acceptable to notice and what must be ignored. Children often speak with startling honesty. Not because they fully understand reality, but because they have not yet learned to filter themselves completely. They describe invisible friends, strange dreams, feelings they cannot explain, moments of knowing that seem impossible for their age. Most adults dismiss these experiences automatically. Imagination, fantasy, developmental creativity. And certainly, much of childhood perception does emerge through imagination. Children inhabit symbolic worlds naturally. Their minds remain fluid, creative, highly associative. But not every account fits comfortably into ordinary explanation. Throughout history, parents have reported children describing places they have never visited, people they have never met, events they could not reasonably know. Some children speak of sensing emotional tension before adults openly express it. Others describe dreams that later appear strangely connected to real events. Some react intensely to environments or individuals without visible reason. Again, caution is essential. Children are impressionable, suggestible. Their memories are flexible. Adults can unintentionally influence interpretation through attention and questioning. Many extraordinary claims dissolve under careful investigation. This must be acknowledged clearly. And yet, the persistence of such reports across cultures and generations remains fascinating. Because humanity repeatedly encounters the same pattern. Young children often appear unusually sensitive. And that sensitivity frequently fades with age. Why? Perhaps because childhood consciousness operates differently before heavy conditioning solidifies perception. A young child has not yet fully accepted the rigid boundaries adults consider unquestionable. The world still feels alive, mysterious, open. The line between imagination and reality remains permeable. And perhaps this openness allows forms of perception adults gradually suppress within themselves. Or perhaps children simply notice more because their attention remains less filtered by expectation. Adults move through reality efficiently, categorizing rapidly, ignoring enormous amounts of information automatically. Children observe slowly, deeply, curiously. What adults dismiss instantly, children often examine carefully. This alone may explain part of their unusual sensitivity. But there may be something more subtle occurring as well. Modern neuroscience shows that the developing brain functions differently than the adult brain. Children often operate in slower brainwave states associated with imagination, deep learning, and subconscious absorption. Their nervous systems remain highly receptive, highly impressionable. The boundaries between conscious and subconscious processing appear more fluid during early development. Perhaps this neurological openness contributes to experiences adults later lose access to. Ancient cultures often treated children differently for this reason. Some traditions believed very young children remained closer to unseen dimensions of consciousness before social identity fully formed. Others believed children carried intuitive wisdom adults had forgotten. Again, interpretations varied. But the recurring idea remained remarkably consistent. Childhood was viewed not merely as intellectual immaturity, but as a state of unusual sensitivity. Modern culture, however, tends to prioritize rapid conditioning. Children are taught quickly what is real, what is imaginary, what deserves attention, what deserves embarrassment. And this process begins early. A child describes sensing something unusual. Adults laugh nervously. Correct them. Redirect them. Explain away the experience immediately. Not necessarily from cruelty. Often from discomfort. Adults themselves have usually been conditioned to distrust anything outside conventional explanation. And so the cycle continues. Sensitivity becomes silence. Observation becomes self-doubt. The child gradually learns which perceptions receive approval and which invite ridicule. Over time, many stop speaking about unusual experiences entirely. Eventually, some stop noticing them. Attention shapes perception. And whatever is repeatedly ignored tends to fade from conscious awareness. This process may represent one of the most significant forms of conditioning humanity undergoes. Not suppression through force, but suppression through normalization. Through repeated social reinforcement shaping the boundaries of acceptable perception. By adulthood, most individuals have become deeply identified with consensus reality. The unseen becomes uncomfortable. The mysterious becomes irrational. The intuitive becomes secondary to external validation. Yet traces of early sensitivity often remain hidden beneath the surface. Many adults still remember strange experiences from childhood they rarely discuss openly. A dream that later came true. A presence they cannot explain. An invisible friend that felt entirely real. An overwhelming feeling about a person or place later proven meaningful. These memories linger quietly because they resist complete dismissal emotionally, even when logic attempts to reinterpret them later. There is another possibility worth considering carefully. Perhaps childhood sensitivity is connected not to supernatural powers, but to reduced internal noise. Children have not yet accumulated decades of mental clutter. Fear-based conditioning. Social masks. Endless distraction. Constant analytical filtering. Their perception may remain more immediate. More direct. Less interrupted by internal commentary. If so, then what people call psychic ability may partly involve recovering forms of attention once natural in early life. Not becoming something superhuman, but remembering something forgotten. This possibility changes the entire conversation. Because it shifts the focus away from extraordinary powers and toward perception itself. Awareness itself. The ability to observe reality without constant mental interference. And perhaps this explains why many contemplative traditions speak of becoming childlike in awareness. Not childish, but open, present, curious, undivided. A mind less trapped within rigid conceptual frameworks. There is also a darker dimension to this subject. Children are highly vulnerable to emotional environments. They absorb fear rapidly, conflict rapidly, anxiety rapidly. Trauma shapes the nervous system profoundly during early development. And a frightened child often learns quickly that sensitivity is unsafe. So defenses emerge. Emotional walls. Disconnection. Suppression. The intuitive system gradually closes for survival. This may explain why some individuals report losing unusual sensitivity after emotionally difficult experiences. The nervous system prioritizes protection over openness, survival over subtle awareness. And perhaps modern civilization itself encourages this closure continuously. Constant stimulation, constant fear, constant distraction. The inner world becomes crowded long before deeper awareness can stabilize. A society disconnected from silence produces adults disconnected from themselves. And disconnected people become easier to condition externally. Yet despite everything, the strange reports continue. Generation after generation. Children sensing things adults overlook. Speaking truths they cannot explain. Observing emotional realities hidden beneath surface appearances. Enough accounts to sustain mystery. Enough to keep the question alive. What if children occasionally perceive aspects of reality adults have trained themselves not to notice? Not perfectly. Not infallibly. But genuinely. And if so, what exactly is lost during conditioning? What inner capacity slowly fades beneath social programming? What hidden sensitivity becomes buried beneath noise? These questions lead directly toward the final stages of this journey. Because once a person begins examining childhood openness, another realization emerges naturally. Modern civilization may not merely distract human attention accidentally. It may shape attention deliberately. Through systems designed to capture awareness continuously. To direct thought continuously. To prevent sustained self-observation almost entirely. This brings us toward one of the deepest questions of all. The system of distraction itself. The machinery of attention. And why silence has become one of the rarest experiences in the modern world. But before moving forward, pause for a moment. And remember carefully. Was there ever a moment in childhood you could never fully explain? A feeling. A dream. A knowing. Something dismissed long ago. Yet never completely forgotten. Because sometimes the oldest memories carry the faintest echoes of what the mind once perceived naturally. Music. Scrolling. Messages. News. Entertainment. Conflict. Information without end. The modern nervous system rarely rests. And a mind in constant reaction becomes easier to direct unconsciously. This is not necessarily the result of some singular hidden conspiracy. In many ways, it is simply the natural consequence of systems designed around profit, engagement, and behavioral influence. Human attention became economically valuable. And once something becomes valuable, powerful systems emerge to capture it. Algorithms learn emotional triggers. Fear holds attention. Outrage holds attention. Desire holds attention. Conflict holds attention. So these emotions become amplified continuously. Not because humanity consciously chose this environment, but because reactive minds generate engagement. And engagement generates power. Over time, people begin living almost entirely outwardly. Constantly consuming. Rarely observing themselves deeply. The inner world becomes neglected. Silence becomes uncomfortable. Stillness becomes unfamiliar. And perhaps this is one of the most significant transformations in modern human consciousness. People no longer sit alone with their own minds. Not for long. The moment discomfort appears, distraction removes it. But discomfort often carries information. Restlessness reveals fragmentation. Anxiety reveals imbalance. Loneliness reveals disconnection. Grief reveals unresolved memory. And intuition often emerges only after noise subsides. If the mind remains continuously stimulated, subtle perception struggles to surface at all. This may explain why so many ancient traditions emphasized solitude, meditation, contemplation, fasting, silence, and retreat from ordinary stimulation. Not because the external world was evil, but because endless distraction weakens awareness. A distracted mind reacts automatically. An attentive mind observes. And observation changes everything. Once a person begins observing their own thought patterns carefully, many hidden mechanisms become visible. Emotional triggers become visible. Conditioning becomes visible. Fear-based narratives become visible. The automatic nature of thought itself becomes visible. And perhaps this is why distraction remains so powerful. Because self-observation interrupts unconscious programming. A person constantly distracted rarely examines what they truly believe. Why they believe it. What fears shape them. What narratives define their identity. They simply continue reacting. Repeating. Consuming. Moving forward automatically. Ancient philosophers often warned that the unexamined mind lives mechanically. Pulled by impulse. Emotion. Social conditioning. External influence. Without awareness, human beings become highly programmable. Not because they are weak, but because repetition shapes perception naturally. Modern systems understand this deeply. Advertising depends upon repetition. Political systems depend upon repetition. Media narratives depend upon repetition. The human mind absorbs patterns continuously until repetition begins feeling like truth. This does not mean all institutions operate maliciously. Reality is more complex than simple villains and victims. But it does mean human attention is constantly influenced by forces seeking to shape emotion, belief, and behavior. And most people underestimate how deeply this occurs. Even identity itself becomes influenced through repetition. People internalize roles, labels, social expectations, cultural narratives. Eventually, many forget that identity was shaped gradually through external reinforcement. The constructed self begins feeling absolute, permanent. And yet, beneath all conditioning, awareness itself remains untouched. Quietly observing. Always present beneath thought. This realization appears repeatedly within contemplative traditions worldwide. The idea that human beings are not merely the contents of consciousness, but the awareness observing those contents. Thoughts change. Emotions change. Beliefs change. Identities change. But awareness remains. Still. Watching. Most people rarely encounter this deeper awareness clearly because the mind remains too crowded. Too noisy. Too reactive. Attention constantly pulled outward. And perhaps this outward fixation benefits modern systems greatly. A distracted population consumes more. Questions less. Observes less. Reflects less. A person disconnected from inner awareness becomes easier to manipulate through fear, desire, and emotional stimulation. This is not mystical speculation. It is observable psychology. Fear narrows perception. Overstimulation weakens concentration. Constant interruption fragments attention. Fragmented attention weakens critical thought. And weakened critical thought increases suggestibility. The consequences extend far beyond entertainment or technology alone. Relationships suffer. Memory weakens. Presence disappears. People physically occupy the same room while mentally existing elsewhere entirely. Human beings lose direct contact with immediate experience. The moment itself becomes secondary to endless digital stimulation. And perhaps something deeper is lost in the process. Sensitivity. Intuition. Stillness. Inner perception. The quiet awareness from which deeper understanding emerges. Ancient seekers often withdrew temporarily from society before undergoing initiation. They entered silence intentionally. Not to escape reality, but to encounter it more directly. Without constant interference. Without endless external influence shaping perception moment by moment. Because clarity requires space. And space has become rare. This may be why many people feel internally exhausted despite constant stimulation. The nervous system was never designed for perpetual informational overload. The mind becomes crowded, fragmented, pulled in too many directions simultaneously. And within that fragmentation, deeper awareness becomes difficult to access. Not impossible. Only buried. Buried beneath noise. Buried beneath speed. Buried beneath endless reaction. There is another unsettling realization as well. People often fear silence because silence removes distraction from unresolved inner conflict. When the noise stops, the mind becomes audible. Unprocessed grief emerges. Fear emerges. Confusion emerges. Questions emerge. This is why many avoid stillness unconsciously. Because stillness confronts the self directly. Yet within that confrontation lies transformation. A person who learns to sit quietly with their own mind begins reclaiming attention from external systems gradually. They begin noticing their impulses rather than obeying them automatically. They begin observing emotional manipulation rather than reacting unconsciously. They begin recognizing which thoughts were inherited rather than chosen. And in that moment, freedom begins quietly. Not political freedom alone. Inner freedom. The ability to direct awareness consciously rather than having awareness directed continuously from outside forces. Perhaps this is one of the greatest forgotten powers of the human mind. Attention itself. Focused. Disciplined. Awake. Because whatever controls attention influences reality at the level of human experience. And a civilization unable to control its own attention becomes vulnerable to endless manipulation. But a deeply attentive individual becomes increasingly difficult to program unconsciously. They begin perceiving the machinery itself. The patterns. The emotional triggers. The systems competing for their mind. And once the machinery becomes visible, it loses some of its power. This is why awareness matters. Not as abstract spirituality, but as practical liberation from unconscious reaction. As this journey nears its final stages, one question rises above all others. If humanity has become disconnected from deep awareness through conditioning, distraction, and inherited limitation, what happens when a person begins reclaiming attention intentionally? What begins awakening inside the mind once the noise finally quiets? That question leads us toward the final threshold. The forgotten mind. And the possibility that human consciousness has always been far greater than it was taught to believe. But before moving forward, turn away from the noise for a moment. Sit in silence. And listen carefully. Not to the world outside you, but to the part of yourself that remains beneath all distraction, waiting patiently to be heard. Chapter 11. The Forgotten Mind. There is a part of human consciousness that rarely speaks in words. It does not argue. It does not explain. It does not rush. It simply exists. Quietly. Continuously. Beneath thought. Beneath identity. Beneath the constant movement of mental activity. Most people encounter it only in rare moments. A sudden pause between thoughts. A deep stillness during solitude. A fleeting sense of being aware of awareness itself. And then it disappears again beneath the return of mental noise. This deeper layer of mind is often overlooked because it is not dramatic. It does not produce images by itself. It does not demand attention. It does not compete for dominance within the stream of thought. It is more like a background presence. Always there. Rarely noticed. Yet foundational to every experience a human being has ever had. Thought arises within it. Emotion arises within it. Memory arises within it. Even identity arises within it. And yet, it remains unchanged by any of these movements. Ancient contemplative traditions often pointed toward this directly. Not as philosophy, but as observation. A simple instruction. Notice what is aware of thought. Notice what remains present even when thought changes. Notice what does not come and go. Modern language struggles to describe this clearly because language belongs to thought. And thought is not what is being examined. This is one reason many descriptions of consciousness become confusing. They attempt to use mental constructs to describe what exists prior to mental constructs. The result is often contradiction, or abstraction, or mystery. And yet the experience itself is not necessarily complex. It is often remarkably simple. Stillness. Presence. Awareness without object. No effort required to be aware. Only recognition that awareness is already occurring. Most people overlook this because attention is constantly directed outward. Toward objects. Ideas. Problems. Memories. Plans. Distractions. The mind becomes absorbed in content and forgets the space in which the content appears. Yet without that space, no experience could exist at all. Everything a person has ever seen, heard, felt, or imagined has appeared within awareness. Not separate from it. Within it. This realization can be unsettling at first. Because it challenges the assumption that identity is fixed. Most people identify with thoughts. I am this. I am that. I believe this. I feel that. But thoughts are constantly changing. Emotions shift. Opinions evolve. Memories distort. If identity is built entirely from changing elements, then identity itself becomes unstable. Yet awareness of those changes remains stable. The witness remains consistent even when everything witnessed changes. This does not require belief. It only requires observation. Careful attention. Direct experience. And when this is noticed clearly, something subtle begins to shift. A small distance appears between awareness and thought. Between observer and mental activity. Not separation in a physical sense. But a shift in identification. Thoughts continue. Emotions continue. But they are no longer mistaken as the totality of self. They become events within awareness rather than definitions of it. This shift has been described in many traditions as a form of awakening. Not dramatic enlightenment. Not supernatural transformation. But a reorientation of identity from content to awareness itself. From thinking to noticing. From reaction to observation. And with this shift comes a quiet but profound change. Emotional reactions lose some of their grip. Fear becomes less absolute. Thought becomes less commanding. Internal noise becomes easier to observe without being consumed by it. This does not mean emotions disappear. Or thought stops. It simply means they are no longer the sole authority within consciousness. There is now something within awareness that can observe them. And in that observation, space appears. Space for choice. Space for clarity. Space for response rather than reaction. Modern psychology has begun exploring aspects of this through mindfulness-based approaches. Attention training. Metacognitive awareness. The ability to observe thoughts rather than automatically believe them. These practices demonstrate measurable effects on stress regulation, emotional stability, and cognitive flexibility. which suggests that ancient contemplative insights may align with observable aspects of human cognition. Not as mysticism, but as structured attention training. Still, the deeper implications remain difficult to fully articulate. Because this awareness does not feel like an object within experience. It feels like the field in which experience occurs. And fields are difficult to define from within the contents they contain. There is also a profound paradox here. The more a person tries to grasp awareness as an object, the more it seems to slip away. Because awareness is not something that can be held. It is what is doing the holding. Not something to obtain, but something already present. This is why many teachings emphasize simplicity. Not complexity. Not accumulation of knowledge. But direct noticing. And yet, despite its simplicity, most people overlook it entirely. Because attention is habitually directed outward. And because modern life reinforces constant outward orientation. Toward productivity. Toward consumption. Toward achievement. Toward distraction. The result is a mind that rarely returns to its own source. A mind so engaged with content that it forgets the space in which content arises. And yet, even in the midst of extreme distraction, this awareness remains untouched. It does not become damaged. It does not become fragmented. It does not become lost. It simply remains unnoticed. Waiting. Not in time, but beneath time. This is why it is sometimes described as timeless. Not because it exists in some distant metaphysical realm, but because it is present in every moment equally. Past and future appear within it. But it does not appear within past or future. Only now exists directly. And awareness is always aligned with now. There is another aspect of this realization that often goes unspoken. When identity shifts from thought to awareness, a sense of separation begins to soften. The boundary between self and experience becomes less rigid. Life is no longer observed as something happening to a separate individual alone in a world, but as experience unfolding within awareness itself. This does not erase individuality, but it reframes it. The sense of isolation can diminish. The sense of fragmentation can soften. A quiet sense of continuity becomes more noticeable beneath changing experience. However, it is important not to turn this into ideology or belief system. Because the moment awareness becomes conceptualized rigidly, it becomes another thought structure. And what is being pointed to is not a structure. It is the recognition of what is already here. Before structure. Before interpretation. Before belief. This is also where misunderstanding often occurs. People attempt to chase extraordinary experiences. Visions. States. Phenomena. But the forgotten mind is not found in extraordinary experience. It is found in ordinary awareness itself. Right now. In the simple fact that experience is being known. There is also caution needed here. Because the mind can easily interpret these ideas as escape from reality, or detachment from life. But true awareness does not remove engagement. It clarifies it. A person still lives, still acts, still feels, but with less unconscious entanglement. Less automatic reactivity. More presence. More clarity. As this exploration reaches its final threshold, the central question becomes unavoidable. If awareness itself has always been present beneath thought, identity, and perception, then what exactly has been forgotten? And what would it mean for humanity to remember it fully? Not as belief, but as direct experience. That question leads into the final chapter. The return. Not to something new, but to something that was never truly lost. Only overlooked. Chapter 12. The return. There are journeys that lead outward into the world. And there are journeys that lead inward into the self. This has been the second kind. Not a journey toward absolute answers, but toward deeper questions. Toward observation. Toward awareness. Toward the possibility that the human mind may contain far more depth than modern life allows most people to notice. Throughout this exploration, we have moved carefully through territories often ignored, dismissed, feared, romanticized, or misunderstood. Intuition. Dreams. Symbols. Focused intention. Energetic influence. The sensitivity of childhood awareness. The hidden architecture of belief. The machinery of distraction. And finally, the silent presence beneath thought itself. None of these subjects were presented as unquestionable truth, nor as fantasy, but as invitations to observe more carefully. Because the greatest limitation placed upon human consciousness may not be lack of ability, but lack of attention. People often search for extraordinary power while overlooking the extraordinary mystery of awareness itself. The fact that existence is being experienced at all. The fact that thought appears. Emotion appears. Perception appears. And something remains aware of all of it continuously. Modern civilization teaches human beings to move quickly, consume quickly, react quickly, judge quickly. But deeper understanding rarely emerges through speed. It emerges through stillness, through observation, through silence deep enough for the hidden patterns of the mind to become visible. Perhaps that is why so many ancient traditions guarded silence so carefully. Because silence reveals. It reveals fear, conditioning, illusion, attachment. But it also reveals clarity, presence, and a form of intelligence deeper than constant mental noise. The forgotten powers of the human mind may not begin with telepathy, or clairvoyance, or distant perception. Perhaps they begin somewhere simpler. The ability to remain fully attentive. The ability to observe without immediate reaction. The ability to direct consciousness intentionally instead of living mechanically through conditioning alone. Such abilities sound ordinary. Yet in a distracted world, they become extraordinary. A person who truly controls their attention becomes difficult to manipulate. A person who understands their own mind becomes difficult to deceive. A person who can remain calm amidst fear begins perceiving reality differently than those consumed by reaction. And from that clarity, deeper perception may emerge naturally. Not through force. Not through fantasy. But through awareness refined over time. This journey was never meant to convince you of supernatural certainty. It was meant to reopen inquiry. To remind you that mystery still exists. That consciousness remains only partially understood. That the inner world deserves exploration just as deeply as the outer world. And perhaps most importantly, to remind you that not everything meaningful can be measured immediately. Some truths must first be observed directly, quietly, personally, without the noise of constant distraction shaping interpretation. If there is one thing to carry forward from this exploration, let it be this. Pay attention. Pay attention to your thoughts, your emotions, your dreams, your intuitions, your patterns, your reactions, your attention itself. Because awareness changes what it touches. And the moment unconscious patterns become visible, transformation quietly begins. Not all at once, but gradually. One observation at a time. One moment of clarity at a time. One interruption in automatic living at a time. Perhaps the mind was never truly powerless. Only distracted. Perhaps the door to deeper awareness was never locked. Only forgotten. And perhaps the greatest mystery is not whether hidden abilities exist, but how much human consciousness has yet to discover about itself. The answers may not arrive suddenly. They may unfold slowly, through silence, through observation, through direct experience, and through the courage to remain open without abandoning discernment. So as this journey comes to an end, let the inquiry continue within you. Remain curious. Remain observant. Remain aware of the stories shaping your perception. Remain aware of where your attention goes. Because where attention flows, identity follows. And identity shapes reality more quietly than most people realize. Thank you for listening to The Forbidden Powers of the Human Mind. Abilities humanity was conditioned to forget. Closing reflection. If this exploration resonated with you, if it opened questions within your mind, or reminded you of experiences you had long forgotten, take a moment to reflect before returning to the noise of the world. And if you wish to continue exploring consciousness, perception, symbolism, awareness, and the hidden dimensions of the human experience, be sure to subscribe. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or experiences. And share this audiobook with others who may be searching for deeper understanding beyond the surface of ordinary life. Your support helps these explorations continue. And perhaps more importantly, it helps keep inquiry alive in a world increasingly overwhelmed by distraction. Until next time, remain aware, remain curious, and listen carefully to the silence beneath thought.